Dear colleagues and friends, thank you for dedicating your time today to join us for this session. On behalf of the entire Fly Battle team, I would like to extend this warm and enthusiastic welcome to all of you, and especially to our esteemed guest, Dr. Shawhin Roudbari, who generously has accepted our invitation to join us today and share his research and projects with us today. Okay, I'm Mariam Karimi. I'm honored to be the moderator of this session today, which is the third of a series on art, architecture, and the issues of social justice. Our group, Fly Battle, is a community-run organization with the goal of connecting scholars, researchers, and building a platform for idea exchange. Our session today is going to be around 2 hours. In the beginning, I will further introduce our guests. I will read an abstract that Shawhin has shared with us in advance to set the stage for the conversation that follows. And then Shawhin will have his presentation for around half an hour, and we'll pursue with the QA session, which you can ask your questions in that time frame. Okay, so that being said, let's do this. Let me share my screen. Okay, and here. Okay. Dr. Shawhin Roudbari is an associate professor in environmental design at the University of Colorado Boulder. He studies ways designers organize to address social problems and human rights abuses. In doing so, Shawhin bridges sociological studies of social movements and race with architectural theory. This focus emerged from interviews he conducted with Iranian architects during his dissertation research, where Shawhin learned about ways architects build institutional power to challenge the state. Supported by the National Science Foundation and community impact grants, Shawhin research contributes to theories, practices of contentious politics, and employs ethnographic and speculative design methods. He is a founding member of the Dissent by Design Research Collective, which has published work in leading sociological, architectural, and interdisciplinary journals. Shawhin organizes with Dark Matter University and is co-director of the Center for Community Engaged Design and Research. So the abstract. Can one argue that a lecture hall is inherently white supremacist in its design and architecture? In this conversation, we'll review examples of how white supremacy manifests in architectural scales of a space. We'll build on a definition of white supremacist spaces as ones in which experiences and opportunities for joy, recreation, work, residence are systematically skewed to uplift white-generated and white-maintained privilege. Whereas most studies of a space of white supremacy focus on urban scales of a space, redlining, and neighborhood segregation, we'll use this conversation to test the scalar limits of white supremacy as a concept that can make visible forms of everyday injustice. Perfect. Thank you, Shawhin. We are so excited to hear and see your presentation.
Thank you, and thanks for this invitation, and hello, everybody. You mentioned at the end conversation, and I do really want this to be a conversation. There's most of the ideas that I'll talk through are things I'm struggling with and don't have answers to. And so selfishly, I was thinking about sort of the goals of this presentation. Part of it was to share the work, but the more selfish part was I would love, just from the range of disciplines and ideas that are represented here, to get input from you all. So I will have some questions for us as I go through some slides, and I want us to think together through some things. So let me share my screen and we'll get going. All right. Let me try something else real quick too. Can I just do this and want it to look okay? Give me one more second. Let me try another different option. Okay. Okay. Do you all see the big-ish slide?
Yes,
okay.
we can.
Cool. Okay, so I'll talk just as a light structure for the conversation. I'll start talking a little bit about residential architecture, then we'll move to institutional architecture. And then I want to see if we can abstract from that some general ideas about spatial configurations. So that gets a little bit more kind of theoretical. And then if there's time, I have some slides with recent projects where we've applied some of these ideas. If not, we don't have to look at those. So I'm going to use this image as a way to warm up our thinking. So let me share first a tentative definition of white supremacist space. And then I'll actually invite you all to share your reflections on this image as a white supremacist. So to me, a white supremacist space can be thought of as a space that perpetuates the myth of white superiority, white achievement, white dominance, ingenuity, cultural supremacy, political supremacy, and racial difference. And this builds on definitions of some sociological scholars like Joe Finnegan and others who write about white supremacy. And I'm kind of marrying that with George Lipsitz's work into kind of coming up with a spatial definition for it. So let's let that linger as a tentative definition in our mind. White supremacist space as a space that perpetuates these myths of white superiority. So with that in mind, when we look at this image, I'm curious, and this is where I'm going to ask you all to share your thoughts. What comes to mind about white supremacy when we look at this image? Is there anything that this evokes for us? And hearing the thoughts in the group will help me just kind of like gauge, yeah, where we come at for something like this. So I'll pause and I'll invite you all to share.
Can I say something?
Please.
You know what? Just the perfect advertised model of family in North America: a husband and wife and 2 kids and a suburban home, right? That's the ideal family structure.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's really important. And I think there's that like idea of an ideal. There's sort of like, to me, the first thing that stands out with this is there's sort of like this heteronormative ideal, like a husband, a wife, 2 kids. So there's like this procreation thing. There's this, there are those models that have to do with like gender and sexuality that seem very obvious, but then also I think race too. So I wonder if either Mariam or anybody else could take it a little further and tell us if there is something about whiteness that's tied to that ideal, or that's, yeah, expressed in this image.
May I ask a question, please?
Yeah, go for it.
Sure. So let me take us one step behind, and if you please explain to me why you think that we should find something racist or race related in this. It seems like your questions presupposes a critical race theory as a background, which obliges the viewers, the audience, whatever, to find something about race in this. And I'm more interested to know why you think that the critical race theory applies here, and then the viewers must find something racist in this picture.
Yeah, what a great question. So I think, especially looking at the built environment like we're looking at here, if we don't ask questions about racism, and I think other axes of privilege, so whether it's patriarchy, whether it's heteronormativity, and other axes, and I'll just talk about race. I think if we don't ask those and we don't presuppose those and I'll actually kind of like take it to the extreme just as a provocation, if we don't ask that of every environment, every mundane, everyday environment, not just the extreme intentionally racist environments like, say, a prison or something like that, which, a lot of critical race theory has its focus on justice systems and so on. But if we go beyond that and we look at every single environment, I worry that if we don't interrogate them with those lenses, then we become complicit in perpetuating the harms that those spaces are documented to infer onto people who occupy them. So there's a lot of research that tells us that, suburban segregation causes great amounts of harm to non-white communities through educational disenfranchisement, health disparities, and other things like that. So to answer your question, I think that's why we need to ask it, why we need to presuppose it, even if we land at a result of, I don't see this as racist, or I don't see this as white supremacist, or there is no way that you can interpret what we're seeing on the screen right now as a white supremacist space. Even if we land at that, I think the interrogation needs to happen. So I'll offer that, Humayun, as a quick response, but I'm curious, yeah, if that's satisfactory, or if you have a further thought on that, because I think it's a really great question.
Sure. So, the critical race theory started in law, and and then applied to other branches of science. And now you're an architectural scientist, and you're using it to advance your research agenda. The thing with critical race theory is its catch-22 dilemma that it creates for the audience. In one way, if I see the race, I am racist. If I come and says like, look, any statistical analysis, any data shows that one race is subject to this and the other race is not subject to this, then I'm racist, because that's a race-based statement. On the other hand, if I don't see race in situations like this picture, then I have the luxury of, living in the white privileged society, and now I'm perpetuating it. Mm-hmm. So this catch-22, other than the fact that might, raise suspicious eyebrows, other than that, I don't think it's very effective in encouraging people to rethink the issue of race. It very well deter, because in psychology there is this cognitive behavioral therapy. It's very known for a long time, the approach. It's like, if you start saying to people like, look, you're racist, and you don't know you're racist. Now we're trying to let you know that you're racist, and it's not gonna work. It's gonna deter the group of people that one trying to attract, So anyway, it was just a question. I'm sorry, I'm gonna shut up and listen to you.
No, don't be sorry at all. No, this is great. I mean, I love this. So I'll share a couple other thoughts really quickly, and then I'll pass it to Moby. I think they have a question as well.
Yes. Yeah.
But Moby, let me quickly share a thought on what Humayun followed up with, because I think it's so important. That catch-22 is a really rich thing, and I struggle with that too. I will say that, that framework that is popularized by, say, like Ibram Kendi, if anybody's read that, he has a sort of popular nonfiction book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and he has popularized this idea of like, we're all a racist, and we're all racists unless we're anti-racist. I see that as potentially something that contributes to this dilemma that you're identifying, Humayun, that maybe, by all acknowledging that we are racist, we participate in these systems of racism, we perpetuate them. I think that might be a variable, and I'll add one other quick variable that I hope we'll come back to, is the lens of Afro-pessimism, and that's a really it's new to me, and I've started to read Wilderson's piece. There's a text called Afro-pessimism, where he talks about kind of like Edward Said and Orientalism, but that whiteness is defined through the subjugation of Blackness, and that to be in this world, this kind of white dominant world, one must be anti-Black racist. That a lot of the status of whiteness in this country is not by accident. It's by an active recreation of racist structures, racist institutions, but also racist individual behaviors. So I'll put a pin on that, but I think what you're saying is getting me to think about those frameworks too, and I think it's really important. But I'll pass to Moby. Thank you, Humayun.
All right. So I just wanted to ask this question regarding this image. And, as a designer, we all go through a lot of visuals on a daily basis. I think any image, any visual that we see, it needs to have a context, right? Because if we just, example is this image, leaving it to your audience imagination, then we just leave it there, how they perceive. That depends on their, their upbringing, their thought process, their friends, their family circle. So lots of factors could impact on decision making of looking at this image, right? But I think if this image was presented with some keywords, some headline, then that could be completely different. So example is this: if I take this image, I write future goals, very positive. Everybody wants to build a family, have a nice house to live, and second could be growth. You want to buy a house, you have a young family, and you want to sustain that house for a long time for your family, your kids to grow, and you want to make memories. So what I am trying to get into is this: the context, it's important, but that has to be seen somewhere, not just individual imagination. So when I see this image, of course I see white individuals, right? I see white family there, but that then I don't see their faces, right? I'm just now I assume because of their, I guess, what I can see from the skin, right? But then on the same time, I also think a young family full of ambitious and goals are trying to build their future together, right? So that would be my thought process. But yeah, I'll just stop here. Thank you.
That's awesome. Yeah, no, I love it. And like, for example, Moby, other clues in here is like the for sale sign toward the left, or the automobile, like the dress that people are wearing. There are all these clues that, you know, maybe inherent context or not enough context. So I think that's a really great point. And I think it signals for me this project that I guess I'm hoping to undertake in our research, but also with us in this conversation is, can we bring, I'm so happy you used that word. It's really helpful for me. Can we decontextualize? So just kind of as a provocation, I don't know the answer to this, but can we decontextualize those things and say that inherent in specific material elements of space is a white supremacy? So I just switched the slide to this image of a man pressing a doorbell. So now that we're warmed up a little bit, and I think with your question, Moby, can we go in the other direction? Is there a possibility where we look at something like this and we, without knowing the context, I mean, this might be an all-Black neighborhood. This might be a lawyer who's advocating for formerly incarcerated people's rights, who are, predominantly Black and brown in this neighborhood. We don't know that context. With that in mind, can we say that some things about this are inherently white supremacist? And I'll come back with a further thought on what you said, Mo, because I think it's a really great question. But let me open this back up to you, or to anybody else in the group. Can anybody offer, right or wrong, sort of an interpretation of something in this image that you might decode as white supremacist? Minush. Oh, I'm not sure. I thought you unmuted. And as I'm looking at this with you, it's such a stretch for me. Like, it remains a stretch to look at this and say, can I say there's something inherently white supremacist about any aspect of this image? But yeah, let me pause for another just 30 seconds and see if anybody can make that stretch. Yeah, Human, I see your comment. Looks like a film noir scene. It totally does. I think it's really difficult. Whitney.
Well, based on, I didn't manage to read all 3 articles. I only managed to get through 2 before we started today, but based on stereotypical suburban houses in, I'll say, the States specifically, because why not? It would be suggested that this house would belong to a white family because it's so pristine and it's got these kind of Romanesque columns, and it looks high end. Whereas stereotypically in a neighborhood of color may not have that level of high-endedness. That's about the only thing I can draw from it that would suggest it could potentially have any semblance of white superiority, even if it's completely unintentional.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. So maybe there's, is it through class and the presumed class of this house based on the image, whether it's, it's specific architectural elements like the style of those columns, it's some state of kind of like cleanliness or like, you know, expensiveness of the materials. Are there some clues about class that then help, that through correlation we could say, okay, this is maybe also about race? I think that's a really important question. Let me share a passage with us. And I pulled this out of one of the papers, I think. I didn't expect anybody to read them, so that's awesome that you did. This is it's a short paragraph, it's a short passage, 2 slides, and I'll read it out loud from Claudia Rankine's book. I don't know if you all know Claudia Rankine. She's a poet and she writes a lot about race and racism. And this was a book from 2014, I think, called Citizen, an American Lyric. So in this passage, she says the following. The new therapist specializes in trauma counseling. You have only ever spoken on the phone. Her house has a single gate that leads to a back entrance she uses for patients. You walk down a path bordered on both sides with deer grass and rosemary to the gate, which turns out to be locked. At the front door, the bell is a small round disc that you press firmly. When the door finally opens, the woman standing there yells at the top of her lungs, "Get away from my house. What are you doing in my yard?" It's as if a wounded Doberman Pinscher or a German Shepherd has gained the power of speech. And though you back up a few steps, you manage to tell her you have an appointment. You have an appointment? She spits back, then she pauses. Everything pauses. Oh, she says, followed by, oh yes, that's right, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. So passages like this from Claudia Rankine and many others, they help me better understand how specific things like doorbells, like deer grass, might be tied up in the experience of white supremacy. I think for many of us, these are not part of the experience of space, but I think for many others of us, they are, whether consciously or subconsciously. So let me dig a little deeper and see if we can kind of tease out this connection. So I'm going to go through a series of slides here, and I'll offer this just sort of as a provocative comparison, and we'll come back to it. But I want to think about this idea of emplacement, or fixing something into position, and how the white gaze, white spectatorship, Black subjecthood are all kind of wrapped up maybe in this dynamic of emplacement in the built environment. So let me show these next images. So this is a map of a plantation in Virginia, and it was mapped in 1960, but it's a historical plantation. And you'll see just where my mouse is, number 5 is the slave auction block, and we'll look at that in a second. So this is number 5 here. And then 2 structures over, number 7 are the slave quarters. And then number 1 is the main house off here to the left. And so when we look at the auction block, this is an image of it as it stands. And I'll come back to Catherine McKittrick in a second. She's a geographer. She's a Black feminist geographer. She's written a lot about the auction block, but also other kinds of structures and Black geographies. But I found her treatment of this specific sort of like tectonic element for architects, but like, like this very like almost like primitive stacking of stones. She talks about how this is wrapped up in the story of white supremacy of the plantation. So Moby, going back to that context that you mentioned, yeah, that context is very significant here. This could be a stack of stones, or it could be a slave auction block. This is that building on the right that's just past the auction block, and these are the slave quarters at this plantation. So these are what the architecture. This is what the architecture looks like. And what I think is what starts to happen just as I look at these 2 images is I think, we can start to make a connection of the auction block as an articulation of white supremacy. And I'll describe the auction block in a second. But I think it's important to see how the same building on the right, the function is very different. It starts to get a little abstracted. It's about housing people, but it's still a similar articulation, and it's an extension of that articulation of white supremacy. On the auction block, a Black enslaved person would be placed on top of it, and a crowd of white buyers and plantation owners would gather around and view the body. And the person who's selling the black body, or the enslaved person, would, do things like, fold up the gums, touch the muscles, do these things. And usually the body's a nude body. And they'd show it to the people that were looking to buy it and put bid on that body. That's one part of the dynamic of the auction block. So it's this pedestal that elevates this body for our view, for this kind of scrutinizing, discerning view. So it has this sort of visual dynamic. But then it does more. And this is what, in Catherine McKittrick in her analysis, she talks about the body gets abstracted onto a background of the plantation. So when the body's placed on the auction block, you see it with the background of the fields that body is being hired to work on. So it's contextualizing, actually, Moby, again, your idea keeps coming back, is contextualizing that body in that kind of productive state that one imagines it to be. There are other forms of productivity with the plantation, which we can get into in the Q&A, but there was, rape and sexual productivity that was a big part of the purchase of slaves on these auction blocks. But with that image of how this block is used, I wonder if there are some of those ideas of the gaze, of the emplacement of the black body, of the enslaved body, that carry over between the block and that auction, the slave quarters, which is a building next to it. So with that in mind, then, I wonder if this comparison becomes a little more provocative for us. If there's a way that we can look at the suburban home, this post-war era suburban home, decontextualized, and see it as part of the lineage, the progeny, rather, the sort of byproduct of structures, physical structures like the auction block. It's something about the emplacement, about the segregation of fixing in location, the body that's different from sort of the supremacy, the supreme white body. So let me leave this here as a provocation too, just to linger a bit, and I'll share this passage by the author who works on kind of studies auction block, Catherine McKittrick. She writes that it becomes very clear that this structure, whether it be a tree stump, a stage, or a table, is created by those who are on, around, and even distanced from the selling point. The processes and acts that produce the auction block demonstrate the ease with which race, ownership, and profit culminated on the auction block and continually substantiated the economic and ideological currency of blackness, whiteness, possession, and captivity. And I think that those ideas of possession, captivity, those are maybe easier for me to translate. Like, I could see possession and captivity in the auction block. Can I see possession and captivity in the slave house? Yeah. Can I see possession and captivity in the suburban home? That's harder, but I think it's starting to make sense for me, a little bit. So that's all kind of looking at historical, overtly racist spaces. But kind of what Humayun got us thinking about with his question earlier, I think it's really important to make this connection to mundane, everyday spaces. So yeah, this is a illustration that was part of a project we did. We published this book called Vigilantism with my collaborator, Jermaine Barnes, and Nikita Simpson's an illustrator, and she did this project where we were looking at ways white owners of homes and condo buildings and things like that, or white residents, police the spaces of their residences. And so in here, the shadow of this woman, looks like Batman, and Batman is sort of that famous vigilante, the person that takes justice into their own hands. And the building is, part of this space that she's protecting. And so we use this illustration as a way of articulating that white supremacy of these kind of everyday spaces of buildings like this in and around our homes. And I'll give one more example, and I'll play a short video for us that maybe drives it home a little bit further. I was in St. Louis a few months ago, and I walked by this building, the Elder Shirts Lofts. This is in downtown St. Louis area, kind of a redeveloping area with kind of upscale condos coming in, a game park, and things that we see in so many cities. And I don't know if you all saw this episode, but let me watch this. Is the audio coming through? Can you all hear that? Oh, it's
Can you play
paused
it
now.
one more time?
I can.
Yes.
Do you live here?
Did I answer my question?
I'm sorry, the keypad is right there.
So sorry, I didn't give context. This is right at the entrance of that building. This is that door that we saw in the previous slide. So this interaction is taking place here. The woman is on the inside and the man who's recording is on the outside. And you may have seen this. This was circulated on the news.
Please move, ma'am.
I can. Do you live here?
Excuse me.
I'm sorry, the keypad is right there.
I understand that, ma'am.
You can film me, that's
I
fine.
understand, ma'am, but you're blocking me.
Into my building. Okay.
It's my business as well, so I need you to get out my way.
Okay, what unit?
I don't need to tell you that information. So excuse me, ma'am.
I'm uncomfortable.
Okay, you can be uncomfortable. That's your discretion. You're uncomfortable because of you. I need you to move out my way, please.
No,
Ma'am, please stop touching me.
I'm not touching
You
you.
just was previously.
I'm not touching you at all.
So I'm going to step in.
I'm not touching you and I'm not in any way doing anything outside of letting my dog go to the bathroom.
I live when you're blocking the door.
What unit?
I'll continue playing it, but I just want us to pay a little bit of attention to the specific behaviors and even the objects, like the physical objects, whether they're architectural or otherwise, that are used to reinforce this emplacement, this idea of like keeping the Black person in his place.
I don't need to tell you that. What unit do you live in?
307.
Okay. Great. I'm on the 4th floor. Excuse me.
No, you don't have a key fob. You are, no.
Ma'am,
If you have that, then okay.
ma'am, you're not security. You're not the property manager. You're not
No,
Mike
but I
Herman.
live here.
Okay, and I live here too. You're not Mike Herman. You're not Rick.
I don't like the fact you have your phone in my face.
Okay, I don't like the fact that you're blocking me for where I pay.
All
So
I'm
look-
asking is what unit?
But you're not, I don't need to tell you that information,
If
ma'am.
you want to come into my building,
It's not your building. You're not the owner. You pay rent.
sir, you walked up on a street.
So, well, let me carry on. I mean, so these kinds of residential expressions or articulations of white supremacy that we looked at are things that, yeah, are everyday occurrences still today. But let me turn our look at institutional for a little bit. And I think with looking at institutional architecture, there are similar articulations of white supremacy, but when you're looking at institutional buildings, a slightly more public sphere, they're larger social groupings of people. And so through institutional architecture, I think we can understand different kinds of expressions of white supremacy. We might call them institutional white supremacy. There are other ideas about hegemonic white supremacy we could talk about a little bit too. But let me start with this. I think this may be easy entry, kind of like what we had with the residential. I think this is an easy entry to understand that there are shared public understandings that are expressed in architecture in the public sphere, and there's a degree of consent that's distinguishable from frictions that we encounter in and around people's homes. Yeah, Huma, I think it's super depressing. If that's what you're expressing. There's a sociologist, Joyce Bell, and she has this really great analysis of, she looks at disobedience of the courtroom as part of expressions of Black power. And she looks at, this is an image from Bobby Seale. This is during trials in 1969. She has another of Angela Davis, and I'll show that in a second. But she looks at ways the Black Panther and the Black Liberation Army activists in that period had come up with and trained themselves in tactics to disrupt the spatial control that the courtroom placed on them and their bodies. So again, as I'm speaking, maybe there's a connection to be made to the auction block, to bringing the Black body and placing it in a location where it's scrutinized by certain systems, whether it's a transaction for a commercial transaction to buy an enslaved body that will work our land and make it more productive, whether it's to purchase a body that I'm going to rape and create children with, or part of this justice system of bringing these Black bodies in and scrutinizing them in ways that are unjust, to then imprison them. So, well, let me hop to the next slide. So, well, actually, like Bobby Seale in this case, he was using these tactics of disrupting order in the courtroom, orders that are, they argued, white supremacist and not inherent in the practice of law and fair judgment. So by speaking out of turn, by dressing in certain ways, by moving their bodies on the chairs that they were placed, through these things, they were disrupting the sort of spatial order of the courtroom. And so as a result, he was bound and gagged, and he was only able to sort of scribble his responses. But this is an example of that disruption of that spatial control of the courtroom. This is an image from a 1972 trial, Black Liberation Army, and Angela Davis here. And what I'd like us to sort of note in this image, it's more clear, are the spatial hierarchies in the room. There's the judge's platform, the jury box, the witness box, the spectator area we don't quite see here, but you can imagine she's looking at the spectator area. And there are the attorney's tables. And kind of connecting back to that idea of the critical race theory stuff that Humayun was talking about, Wendy Leo Moore, she writes about the history of white supremacy in the context of US, legal practice and law. And she talks about the history of the design of courtrooms in the US and their lineage and their archaeology back to plantations, and ways they were designed as spaces for the Black body to be bound and chained, and kind of like a public lynching, to be brought forward for sort of like this public viewing of this, justice. Instead of it being lynching and sort of like, extrajudicial, this was judicial. But that architecture, that fundamental sense of hierarchy remains in our buildings still. So, well, yeah, let me see if I have another example. Well, yeah, okay, let me transition. So for these kinds of spaces, I think it's easy with courtrooms, with prisons, with the plantation. I think it's easy to describe them as white supremacists. They're intentionally that way. They're intentional expressions of a white supremacist system. And if you look at the ways people describe those spaces, even then, during their times, there is that very clear language of white supremacy. So these kinds of spaces, it's easy to argue about architectures of white supremacy. But again, what happens when we go to more mundane, more everyday spaces? And I think that's really what's interesting to me. So with this question, for example, can we describe a classroom as white supremacist? And this maybe tests some of those things that Humayun I brought up that I think are really important. So what I'll do is I'll walk us through just a sequence of slides, and I'll ask us, I'll just pause on these slides just to let us absorb and look at them for just a few seconds per slide. And after this progression, I'll kind of see if there are connections we're making. And there's a specific couple of slides that I'll ask for people's thoughts on. So this is a law school classroom at a University of Akron in Ohio. And as I'm looking at, sorry, I'm not supposed to talk. I'm supposed to let you enjoy it. But, as I'm looking at it, I'm thinking of different spatial hierarchies, those things that we heard about just a few slides ago with the case of the Black Liberation Army and Black Panthers in Joyce Bell's analysis. This is another law school classroom. And as I pause on them, just notice to yourself, what elements do you think can be tied to this narrative that we're playing with in this conversation? This is an amphitheater at a hospital. And I think the more obvious thing here is the portraits of all white people, but the kind of bottom right corner is more interesting to me, the seating. And I wonder, are there ways that the seating, the arrangement of the seating, the material of it, the size of them, their location, is there a way that that's a reflection of that same kind of white supremacy that's very overt in the images? Yeah, mostly white men. Yeah, to me, I think the conversations on white supremacy and patriarchy have a lot, there's so much parallel. There's also important difference, but I think, yeah, absolutely. that's easier for me to understand as the patriarchy in some ways. So again, just maybe 10 seconds, I'll leave this up, but notice what elements or what aspects of this do you think, yeah, Human, that point about sterile space, segregated, regimented, yeah, it's really powerful. Yep. Okay. So here I'm going to ask if anybody wants to take a dip again. And the comments that you've shared so far are so awesome. I've been taking notes. This is the entrance of Rudolph Hall. This is an architecture school building at Yale University, built in the 60s. Can anybody venture to share an interpretation of this space as white supremacist? Or can we not quite do that? Is that too much of a stretch? And if you think it's too much of a stretch, I'd love to hear that too. Mehdi, what say you? I can see your mind processing deep philosophical ideas.
Yes, it's too much to just digest from just thinking about.
Okay. My wife was watching this. She still has a beef with the Greeks, thousands of years old beef with the Greeks, and I think that might be an easy way for me to start thinking about this with that frieze, that panel of sculptures that's placed above right here as you enter the building. When you see this, to me, I start to think of that kind of narrative of, okay, is there a supremacist narrative? And that's mostly me being jealous, but I think there are these elements. The others are harder for me to see. That's kind of an explicit, there's a lot more explicit symbolism and kind of like communication happening through that frieze. But I wonder about these other things. Do the other things also articulate something? Kind of like the auction block did. It was just a stack of stones. Or this. This is a section cut. So for those people who aren't architecture people, this is like if you took the building and cut half of it off and looked on the inside. This is that same building that we're looking at. I asked the same question about whether or not well, actually, let me leave you with it for a few seconds, and then if nobody hops in, I'll share a story. But same question: can anybody see or imagine some articulation of white supremacy here, or is that too much of a stretch? Is it ridiculous to suggest that this building's layout somehow is white supremacist? So I'll share one story. I asked the same question in another talk, and there was a Black woman architect in the audience, and she graduated from this program, and she was talking about how, so where you see my mouse, can you all see my mouse hovering? Yeah, okay. Where you see my mouse hovering, these are where a lot of the design studios are. So there are a lot of seats, and students are working on these platforms. And she talked about how visible they were from everywhere. From, there are these walkways where, the chair, the dean, professors, other students, visitors walk through, and they can see everybody working away. And she said, as a Black student, there was this inherent pressure that she felt to be twice as good as her peers. And that became overwhelming because of how visible she was in that space. And so what she did was, she said that she had never realized it, but during this conversation, she realized that she always tried to find ways to hide herself from others' view, from the gaze, from that sort of judging, scrutinizing gaze in a predominantly white institution, an elitist white institution. And so to me, that kind of all of a sudden got me thinking, wow, yeah, maybe there are ways that I could even talk about the design of this atrium space as white supremacist. I'm not quite sure. I struggle with it, but her response was a bit of a cue to me. And so I'll leave this quickly as a subliminal message, not intended to dwell on it, but I wonder if things like this, comparisons like this, can be helpful in us drawing connections. We can come back to this if folks are interested later. So I'll just spend a couple minutes to close out by saying that the sort of question I've been really obsessed with and remain obsessed with is, can we theorize fundamental spatial configurations as white supremacists? And by these spatial configurations, I mean things like views, like the gaze, like how we see each other in a space, spatial hierarchy, like, whose desk is higher than whose, if we're in a lecture hall, how does that slope work? Where is the podium? Where is the stage? Can we understand those kinds of things? Or things like thresholds, like doors we walk through, these very basic architectural things, circulation, how one comes into a classroom and moves through a space. Can we understand these things, gaze, thresholds, circulation? Can we understand these as white supremacists? And the reason I'm interested in doing this is because I think it would allow us to theorize white supremacy in a way, in a spatial manner that's different from how it's been theorized so far spatially, which is at the urban scale. So we talk about spatial segregation, neighborhood segregation, those kinds of things. But we don't really have an understanding for, can I say this room that I'm sitting in is white supremacist in some strange way? But I'm really intrigued by that. Intrigued not like in a playful way, but as like it's, my sense is, going back to, again, I think to Humayun's provocation at the beginning, like, what is the purpose of it? And I think it's, as designers, we continue to design places that are very harmful to people without knowing them. For example, Rudolph Hall in that way. They may not be harmful to me. I walk around these spaces mostly, benefiting from the privileges of my race. But I think for other people, these can be traumatic experiences. So I'll share these couple slides. This is a lunch counter. And, I wonder, could we look at a place like this, a very mundane, very everyday space, and describe this as a white supremacist? This happens to be the lunch counter that was part of the Greensboro sit-ins as part of what launched the civil rights movement in the US, where there were, through these acts of disobedience in this space, the students that were sitting at this lunch counter, this is a reproduction of it, but the students who sat in it, they were disrupting that white supremacy of the space that would not allow Blacks to, be patrons. And by the way, parenthetically, obviously this past year, I've been obsessed with kind of if and how these ideas can be translated to the context of Iran, and what we're witnessing there. And I think there are really strong translations. But anyways, to focus, I wonder if theorizing these kinds of basic spatial elements can be productive. This is another example from somebody who was a big inspiration for me thinking about and theorizing these things. This is Craig Wilkins. He's a professor at University of Michigan in architecture. And he has this book, The Aesthetics of Equity. And in the, I think, first chapter, he talks about an experience him and his partner had in a shopping center where they came up to an ATM machine, and he creates this sketch in his book. And he says that Group A, him and his partner, arrived roughly at the same time as Group B. And the person finishing the ATM, the person that was at the ATM finished and moved on. And then him and his partner moved to go to the ATM machine next, and they're Black. And then the other group which were white were grumbling, kind of like, who do they think they are, that they can kind of step in front of us and do this? And the first time I read this 7 or 8 years ago, I was like, well, that's fair. I mean, I don't know exactly who arrived first. It might have been one group or the other. Like, he didn't tell us that in the story. Maybe the white group got there like a split second beforehand. So when I first read it, maybe for years, I felt like he's maybe pushing it too much. I don't see what's wrong in that interaction. 2 people arrived about the same time. One group moves forward to get in. But then with time, I've arrived at this understanding that the white couple understands and believes ownership over this space. That even if the Black couple got there, at the same time, they don't have the right to move forward. They can be scrutinized for their movement in that space in a way that if that couple was white, if Group A was white, Group B would not scrutinize. And inherent in that is this sense of supremacy, of superiority. So what Craig Wilkins did that helped me is to understand how even basic circulation, like who moves where with respect to what object, things that we obsess about as architects, that can be a white supremacist thing. I'm not super convinced. It's still really challenging for me to understand it, but that's kind of like the set of ideas I want to play with. This is a project that some of our students were playing with last year, where they were looking at classrooms on campus and color. We took data about circulation, how students circulated through it, how they entered, so thresholds, gaze, who could see who from where, and like visibility. And what else did we look at? We also looked at hierarchy, spatial hierarchy, and created these color-coded maps, these kind of like heat maps of what were white hotspots, where BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, persons of color students were more vulnerable to hypervisibility, to judgment, and to discomfort. So we're still playing with like, okay, are there ways we can visualize these dynamics that will help us understand them if there is really an idea there, but maybe more importantly, can help us communicate them. So anyhow, I'll pause here. I have some slides, if useful for our discussion, from projects like this that we're using sort of as applications of some of these ideas, but I'll kick it back over to Mariam to facilitate. I think the questions that came up were really exciting for me, so I'm eager to get back into that.
Thank you very much, Shawhin. This was an incredibly relevant and important talk, and I'm so happy to listen to your presentation today. And thank you very much for the articles you shared. They were amazing. I mean, mind-opening. I really like, both the comments that Homayun and Mobi had in the beginning in terms of contextualization, and Homayun in the fact that do we even have to see this, right? Why we should take a position. And I really like this idea because I love this notion of interrogative approach into something that has been spatialized, has been normalized, has been aesthetically, have become a standard, right? And, just to take this position of always interrogating. And I was listening to another talk that you had. You talked about this cognitive liberation of, not being colorblind, understanding that there are unresolved questions, unresolved issues. Yes, that's the first step. The second, there is a solution, and I can be part of this. I can be part of this process of change. And I like that idea because it connects me to something that maybe Heidegger talks about with this notion of Haltun. Either you embed yourself in this tradition that is existing, and it becomes your immune system, or you start interrogating, right? You step out and you start seeing something from a vantage point, and you constantly create that vantage point, but creating more questions for yourself. So I really like this position that you're taking towards race. I have several questions that I can talk about them. I also want to invite the audience to, take, maybe put your questions in the chat or raise your hand so we can take it. But before that, I want to raise this question for you, Shawhin, and I want to know about this ownership of narrative. How you, as a Middle Eastern scholar, right, in terms of the question of your race, how you create a parallel, how you insert yourself within this narrative and apply your agency. So that's a question that I would like you to think about if possible.
Gosh, well, first I'll get there in a second, but let me just say the comments that you just shared, like in the past 2 minutes, helped me actually make sense of my life. So thank you. That was really helpful. And I'm embarrassed that you've listened to any talk I've given. I hope nobody ever has to do that. So thank you. That connection you made between cognitive liberation and this work, I had not made. So that's really juicy. About sort of ownership of narrative. Okay, let me fumble through some ideas and see if it helps me get anywhere close to an answer. Let me start with just conversations that came up during my fieldwork. So my early research was mostly ethnographic. I used to spend most of my time studying activism in the professions, and that started with Iran and then continued here with mostly Black architects and engineers, and looking at their activism. And so this was like, I joined a few organizations, so I was a participant observer, and there the question of my skin tone came up. I also did these sort of unstructured in-depth interviews, so multiple hour-long conversations with people that were they were in control of, and so that was sort of the meat of the methodology that I used. And in both those places, the observations and in the interviews, the question of my own positionality and my race came up a lot. And I often I asked first, I worry about, and I still do, and I did then too, I worry about me studying this kind of thing, studying about anti-Black racism in the US. Let's just start with that. And I got one comment once that I respect a lot, that, yeah, this is not a space for you, because the way you come into this, not having experienced it, you're going, you might take, and the person was sharing this, really positively, but you might take our history and our struggles and interpret it in ways that doesn't do justice. So for example, by focusing on Black trauma, there's this narrative of deficiency, of vulnerability, that maybe most of the Black activists that I was learning from did not care to perpetuate. They're like, that's true, but we have this power, we have this joy, we have this ingenuity. That's the story we want the world to be knowing. We don't want yet another sad story about, the weaknesses that you suppose that we have because of the harms that we experience. So that person said that, yeah, you should not be in these spaces. And that was really important to me. I will say the majority of people, like everybody but that person, maybe dozens of people, said that, one, they said, some of the responses were, this is what got me to think about white supremacy in the first place, was actually those conversations where they said white supremacy is this form of violence enacted by people who white people, and so much of it is on them to understand. And they, so like you, Shawhin, as somebody who can cross over as white, presume I could cross over as white, you need to do that research. So it's actually important that you're doing this research on white supremacy. The burden shouldn't only be on us Black folks who are the subject of white supremacy. So that was one kind of response I heard a lot. A couple of people talked about my being Iranian specifically, and a couple of them knew a little bit about Iran. And for those of you who weren't on this call, I spent middle school and high school in Iran. So I'm Iranian light. I can't claim kind of like really the deep experiences, and having been born there and lived there, I kind of came in and I left again. But they said that perspective, as like, whether it's brown or however you want to call it, you do see white supremacy. You are exposed to it even if you don't know it. There are ways that it harms you, and at the same time you can benefit from a lot of the privileges of white supremacy. And that, a couple of people said that straddling that is actually really useful. Like that's something to take advantage of in your research. So those are some experiences. I'll say, let me fumble through another thing. I'll say that, like I mentioned earlier, when I think we were looking the slide of the ATM machine, I was being honest about, like, I didn't buy the argument, like I didn't quite get it. That still happens, and it happens with a lot of the experiences. Like I've had, Black students and postdocs and people who've moved to Boulder to, live with me and work here. Live in town and work with me at the university. And a lot of times they talk about their experiences in Boulder as a very white, affluent town. And for years, I was very dismissive of it. Somebody saying like, I was in the cafe and the barista, wasn't treating me as friendly as the next white person. And I was like, you're reading too much into it, or, like, you're just not being pessimistic. You're being pessimistic. The people in Boulder are like really kind people. They're really genuine, even if they're mostly white, they really care. But over time, and as I did more research and I learned more, I realized, like, even me, like if I go to dinner with my parents who have stronger Farsi accents, if I don't know it, I'm embarrassed for them to ask for the menu and to ask things, because they're going to ask it in all sorts of awkward ways. I want to do it in the clean way, the way that's like, like, oh, I sound like an American. I know exactly the etiquette of a restaurant. So there are all these ways that I still kind of embody this supremacy, that whiteness, our accents, all these things are better than the fumbling, embarrassing, infantile kind of ways of the others. So it's really problematic. And so let me wrap up my thoughts on your question. I do think my positionality, kind of who I am, it really does affect this work, and in ways I don't know and I can't imagine, and I worry about it all the time. At the same time, I have this feeling that I got from people's responses that I should stay in this and continue to do this work. In anthropology, they talk about like the insider-outsider thing. There's a little bit of that, not quite. So anyway, that's a long non-answer. but I appreciate your question. Yeah.
No, thank you very much, Shahid. It's apparent that you have been thinking about these questions. It seems like you have had this struggle and you have so many ways of, fine-tuning and answering. And actually, the research that you just shared, but when you were talking about this experience of that African American woman in that section of architecture, of all these vantage points, that suddenly she feels like she's highlighted. Her body is highlighted among all these other bodies that they don't look like her, or the images of all these white males on this lecture hall. It reminded me of my own experience as a Middle Eastern woman walking into these spaces and feeling different, right? So this is a very pertinent question. As someone coming from another culture, how we can insert ourselves into a different narrative and have ownership. I know my answer is positive. Yes, we can, but the idea is that how we can draw parallels, how we can bring something from our own experience to make sense of the experience of others, right? And I don't think this is a question just for us. This is a historical question, and as I said, I talked with you earlier, what this formula that Anne and Renee and Margaret Ross tried to answer, and approaching telling the story of Hiroshima and the bomb that was dropped there, right? So very good, and I'm so happy that we started this conversation on this note, and because later on I want to connect it to Iran and ideas of molecular revolutions and civil rights movement, but later after asking some questions from the audience.
Okay.
So
I can't wait for that, by the way. I'm very excited.
No, because this is great. I mean, we are learning from all these to find parallels elsewhere. Yes, questions from the audience?
And I'll just add in parentheses, I hope I said it enough, but like really, like we these are a lot of ideas that I'm struggling with, and like even the project of theorizing this kind of thing, I'm not convinced by any means, but I'm sort of obsessed with it. So if folks have ideas for like abandon it or think about this or look at this, like anything will be very helpful. Mehdi.
Thank you very much, Shawhin. It was a very interesting talk. And I have to say, I shared the topic of the talk with one of my colleagues, and she told me after a day that whenever she sees a new building, she starts to think if it is a white supremacist building. So even beyond Saibot, you are making some impact. So I have many questions actually, but the first one, and maybe the most important one for me, is that why, so in your narrative, race is the central concept. Why is it the central concept? Why don't you, for example, reconstruct the whole narrative around class? I think you can, the picture that you showed us, you could reconstruct all of that, and but with class, why do you emphasize on race that much?
A great question. Let me think through it. Okay, like the last answer, I'm going to be totally useless, but I'm going to think out loud a little bit. The first idea that came to my mind is this idea of racial capitalism. So I'll open that a little bit to talk about how class and race are intertwined, especially in sort of like a capitalist kind of view. But the other thing I'll maybe point out is that maybe for me, sorry, this is the slide I wanted to show was this slide. And I think, I can't remember whose comments, who was sharing, maybe Whitney was talking about this. I think it's possible that class is more visible to me when I look at a lot of like pictures like the ones we saw. Like I can see class. It's maybe more overt. And race to me, again, going back to like who I am, is less overt to me. Like I don't see the space and think race automatically. I mean, now I do because it's been a few years that I've been thinking about it. But if I was somebody different, if maybe if I was a Black student and had navigated different kinds of environments, I may see race here too. So I think part of the answer to your question is I think questions about race have not been answered sufficiently to the degree that questions of class have. I think there's all these axes: gender, race, class, sexuality. These maybe call them like just sociological categories of like individual difference. I think many of them have, you know, light years more that we need to investigate. So none of them are like done and resolved by any means. But I think racism is an underlying logic of space that has not been sufficiently understood. And so we unintentionally perpetuate the same problems. I think with class, it's a little different. I think if let me think through a concrete example. If I'm a developer and coming into my town of Boulder, where it's a very affluent town and homelessness is, you know, part of the expression of our housing crisis, and I build a luxury condo, I understand that I'm not helping that other problem. Like I understand that I'm probably on the wrong side of the housing crisis, but I'm going to do it anyways and make money. I don't know that anybody comes in with that kind of consciousness about race. Like, I'm going to build something, and is this racist or not? I think it is. I think there are things when, you know, somebody comes to this town and walks around, they get an uneasy feeling. I think that happens even for me. If I was honest with myself, I moved here from Berkeley, and Berkeley I thought was very diverse and very welcoming. And then when I came here, I thought people loved me. Like, people are into Sufism here, randomly, a bunch of white people who know about Sufism. And a lot of people speak Farsi. I was like, man, they love Iranians. And for years, I thought like, this is actually a more welcoming space. But over time, I realized that I think both of them are equally racist, Berkeley and Boulder, and that I've been internalizing my own sense of difference by living in these towns. Anyways, sorry, that's a tangent. But one part of my answer to you is I think race is far less theorized, and therefore theorizing it will help us reduce, like, is practical with good impacts. The other part about racial capitalism, and I think maybe we understand this much better than I can express it, but a lot about class, especially in the United States, especially in our time right now, is inextricably tied to race. A lot of the kind of growth of like US capitalism comes out of the plantation and is built on sort of like the backs of Black bodies. And you can't think about class difference without thinking about race difference in the US. It's true, there are wealthy Black people, there are poor white people. That's absolutely true. But when you look at it society-wide, the wealth of whites and the wealth of the United States cannot be cannot be separated from racism and white supremacy. And I can expand on that if anybody wants, but I'll just extend your point a little bit further, even though it wasn't what you're asking about. So class is one thing, and then like a lot in my mind is like environmental justice kinds of issues and so on. And I think the same there. We can't understand kind of climate change. We can't understand environmental injustices without understanding class and, say, capitalism and the way capitalism works and creates class and perpetuates class differences. But then also without understanding race. So those are, I guess, 2 points that I think about in response, Mehdi, to your question. One is like, it's useful, but it's also not actually separated.
Thank you so much.
I'm so useless at answering questions. Sorry, but you guys are just getting me thinking about really cool things. Homayun and then Fazil.
Sure. So, you know, a couple of examples you gave us was courtrooms and classrooms, and how racism is manifested in those structures or the settings or the way they are designed. The question I have, so the whole racism, the Black and white, historically probably begin in the mid 15th century, when, you know, Europeans start to import people of North African descent into Europe. And there are crystal clear historical inferences that, like, prior to that point, they use the terms Black to refer to someone who has black hair, which today we know them, we categorize them in the white, you know, class. But the courtrooms, the classrooms are always been like that, even prior to importation of slaves from North Africa and then other parts of Africa. So now if we try to say like this is built based on a knowledge or concept of white supremacists, how do we reconcile that historical fact with what we know? And you know, going back to even when the time the Bible came around, like 2,000 years ago, you know, historically it came in a in a territory where black, white, and you know, colored people lived together without any problem. So and the courtrooms back in that time looks exactly like the courtrooms we have today. And I'm saying that because my job is to go to the court every day. I've never been feeling that I am in an uncomfortable setting. The example you gave about, I forgot the name, that gentleman in the courtrooms trying to make disturbances and then ended up with a gag order. That could be one example. And yeah, I would be cautious, you know, I would avoid mapping out and overgeneralizing it, because that's exactly what's you know what's happening in the current political discourse. You know, get one example and overgeneralize it. And then that's the second question I have, is to give some feedback in terms of law. So in law, we says a law, a policy is racist if it is worded with racist words, you know, like the text matters, or it was written with the purpose or intent of producing an effect. Now, there might be laws that are super neutral. If you give that law to someone who's not exposed to the idea of racism, like let's say a gentleman in China or a gentlewoman in China who read that law, they would not think that the law is racist. But the social classes in the United States might have, you know, different reflexive, and the key operative word is reflexive response to the law, producing a racist effect. Now that law cannot be said to be racist, again, because it's the response that, you know, evoked by the society, probably brainwashed by the idea of critical race theory, that they tend to see race in everything. That's what I want to ask you as your essentially insight about this. Thanks.
Gosh, I love this. This is like, these are dream questions. Thank you, Hawaiian. I really appreciate it. So I have a few things noted just while you were speaking. And so let me try to get to them one at a time. One is, I think that question about history and how long racism has been documented versus things like spaces like what we're looking at, like classrooms, things like that. Great point. Universities, spaces of learning have existed for, I think, thousands of years. You can even go to kind of more abstract spaces of discourse and dialogue that were designed to facilitate that kind of discourse and dialogue. So it doesn't need to be part, like, we don't need to limit our history of classrooms to just like when universities have existed, or madrasas, or, you know, these kinds of things in all parts of the world. Whenever there was like a design that would facilitate a kind of conversation or discourse, I think I'm agreeing with you, Humayun, that those things precede kind of modern definitions and operations of racism. So I think that's a really good point. However, I do think that the institutionalization of certain architectural forms carries with it significance that translates to racism. So whereas we may have had, I wish I could sketch this, but I'll just describe it. Whereas we may have had it like an amphitheater 2,000 years ago with like a stage and then stairs that kind of went up like that in the round, say, where we had a theater like that, it may not have been understood as racist then, or I might struggle to interpret that as racist. Let me say in parentheses, actually, but there were slaves, there was racism tens of thousands of years, but thousands of years ago as well. And I think those spaces are actually, like, say, like a Greek theater, is a reflection of the racism and this enslavement and the patriarchy of Greek society, for example. But let's come back to that. I do think that the ways these spaces have been institutionalized in the modern era, and I'd say maybe the capitalist era, kind of part of university systems of the past 200 years, really the past 100 years, they are tied to power and white supremacy in ways that they had not been in the past. So it's possible that there is this hypothetical theater somewhere that was not about supremacy. But theaters now, or auditoriums and classrooms now, I think I would argue, are supremacist because of the ways they're institutionalized now in institutions that are about socializing and educating white people to extract benefit in their lives from people that are different. That's inherently the history, I believe, of higher education in the US, of law practice in the US, is Wendy Leomore's argument. And then the easier arguments are of prisons. These are not, just like prisons are, we might say discipline and punishment have been around for thousands of years. Can we say that prisons and jails today are racist? There's been an institutionalization of them in the past couple 100 years, 300 years, that is tied to a specific racist project of putting Black and brown people in prisons and extracting free labor from them. There's a great book I could also cite, White Rage by Carol Anderson, where she talks about this history explicitly. That those spaces now, even though historically maybe they were not racist, now through their institutionalization they are. So I think that's one way I'd maybe start to offer a response to your first question. The second point you made about overgeneralizing, I think that's something I struggle with, and I don't have a good answer for it, but I'll just say some quick thoughts. And maybe I'll use this as a connection with Iran and patriarchy and sort of like gender apartheid. There are things that I see American spectators of the movements in Iran, or of Iran in general over the past 40 years, where they look at it and, I'm thinking specifically, for example, we have National Public Radio in the US, and there was a journalist who was covering things, I think like in September or December, just November or December last year. And she was talking about mostly economic issues and not really paying sufficient attention to the movement that was happening. I think there are ways spectators can come in and see things as kind of like business as usual with disruptions. But I don't think that that's fair. I think for people who are struggling with the outcomes of the inequality, it's not an overgeneralization to say many things in Iran are patriarchal. The way our school systems work, the way our laws work, the way our socialization works, the way the concours works, the way X, Y, Z, the way like a sidewalk is designed, like the way so many things exist. I think it's not actually radical to say it's all patriarchal. And by that is an example, I think I'm getting like too deep in my little rabbit hole here, but nowadays I walk around and I'm looking at my neighbor's house right now, and to me it looks like a plantation house, and it has that symbolism, and it's telling me that. And when they come to me and we have like a Farsi carpet, Iranian carpet outside, and they say this is not a really civilized way to use this space, it clicks for me. I'm like, oh yeah, because the space that you've constructed is full of these white supremacist symbols, and I'm disrupting that. So I interpret all this as racist. So I think that overgeneralizing is potentially a problem. So I think you're probably right, but something in me also thinks not necessarily. Probably the status quo is in the benefit of the holders of power. So when we say everything is racist, all of American judicial system is racist, and policing is racist, and all these like outrageous claims, I actually believe no, they are. We've taken them for granted. I'll say one more small parenthesis and move to the next part of your question. I think gender is another example of that kind of counter argument of overgeneralizing, with gender fluidity now and gender queerness now being more of a part of our conversation. Like Foucault's History of Sexuality tells us that the very idea of masculinity and femininity and our understanding of our own histories and our creation of histories, we've put on a modern perception of gender and sexuality. So when we look back at our historical texts or historical archaeological sites or whatever, when we dig back tens of thousands of years, we look through it with our lens of heteronormativity. It's not necessarily that heteronormativity was the norm, or that masculinity, femininity, male, female is the natural state of humanity. No, it's not. We've perpetuated that myth. So we're not overgeneralizing by saying that it's fine for 80% of the people to be genderqueer and to be, queer sexuality wise. That's maybe the more natural order of things. If we look at different species, we may see those things. So it's a great question about overgeneralizing. I don't think I'm convinced. I think it's not overgeneralizing. That's my response. Okay, I'll keep this last one to 30 seconds and then Fazil, up over to you. Racist, you were talking about, I can't remember the exact question, but the note I had here was racism and, white supremacy is, you're talking about certain laws and what, how to understand laws. That was really helpful for me to understand. A lot of these things, I think one could argue that a racist way of studying law is to say it's about the intent. The anti-racist way of studying law is to look at it about the impact. So who cares how it was authored? Who cares what context it was created in? If somebody wrote a law that says, like this person shouldn't go into this door, this person should go in that door. If they did not intend for it to be racist and it wasn't in a racist, the intention is not racist, great. I think an anti-racist perspective would be, that doesn't mean it's not racist. It's not necessarily about an individual's act of animosity or motivation for segregation that makes something racist. It's about the resulting impact that it has. So take an old law that was totally happy and safe and put it in our context. If it creates racial harm, then it's a racist law. So that's a very naive response to your deep question. So I apologize if it wasn't sufficient, but those are some thoughts. Fazil.
Hi, Shawhin, wonderful. Actually, you covered one of the questions I had. So it was about the connection of your work to Iran's situation, not only last year, but also, the history of Iran, which you already pointed out. You actually had one very great example about the ring bells, and then the difference between the disc, and then we had this actually in our architecture. So basically, there are two different kubeh, or that you knock the door, and one is for men, one is only for women. Actually, from the knocking the door and the sound, there is a border. If you can enter to that room, if you can pass that threshold or not. That's actually something sad about the, in general, architecture and maybe urban space, because it's a very expensive project, and all the time it's very tied to the budget, and it's always in the hands of powerful people. So it can be the government, it can be also again, merchants, I don't know, the one who got money, right? So it's always about, it's not trying to basically unify people, it's actually trying to divide people. And that's actually the place I want to, not being only taking your work forward, and then not being only in the what is being white. Let's redefine the white. And actually, I can say there are different shades of white. We can say that, in Iran, the group of people who has connection to the government are considered as a kind of white. Let's keep in your similar to your title. So they have a kind of privilege to access some places, to take some chairs, and then at the same time, there are so many people are like completely away. There are so many thresholds they cannot really go. And that's actually how the government is actually surviving even this kind of crisis or uprising. Okay, that was so amazing. So I was totally overwhelmed, and I wanted to share my feeling with you.
Can you
that
say
was not a question, maybe?
Can you say the name of the door knockers again?
Yeah, in Farsi we call it kube.
Kube.
Yeah, which is knocker. Knocking is something like, okay. And okay, now the question maybe, or maybe something to share, is that what would be our, like, as an architect, I am probably tied into the whole process of getting money and doing something, a good design for someone, which is probably a kind of far from the people I would like to work for them. But as an activism, like architecture as an activism, what should we do? Should we start undoing some spaces? Should we start unmaking? Should we start trying to, I don't want to use the term deconstruction, but maybe undoing or unmaking would be better. What is your suggestion? What is your point of view? And we should continue on that. Thank you so much. That was, and saying hi from Munich.
Hello.
From Germany. Yeah, it's midnight.
Very cool. I'm honored. And thank you. And I'll say to all of you, I'm actively writing down your questions and ideas are really, really helpful. I didn't know about Kube. That's fascinating. To answer your, not to answer, clearly I've demonstrated I'm not capable of answering, but to think about your question on activism and what can/should we do. Let me share a quick example. I'll just talk through quickly and I'll pretend to talk through quickly. So this is, you still see the slides, right? I think. Okay. This was a installation we did with the group Dark Matter University last September in Lisbon, in Portugal, which happens to be kind of the capital of the modern slave trade, the people who kind of started this transatlantic slave trade. We have much older slave trades. Anyways, this was the gallery that we were supposed to do it in, and this was our concept. It was sort of this digital archive, these little dots that we were going to put on the ground and on the walls of this gallery that showcased the work of BIPOC, Black, Indigenous, people of color designers. So it was going to be this kind of digital archive. And this was part of the architectural triennial in Lisbon, and the curator had selected us, and we were kind of moving in, and we were there that day to install. And the curators of this museum, not the whole triennial, but this specific museum, didn't want us in that space because of how unpure the work that we did was looking like. It was very sloppy, scatter all over the walls. I mean, we thought it was artistic, but they're like, this doesn't fit with the spirit of our museum, which is this. This was the spirit of the museum that you saw here. So instead, they gave us the entrance, which they were hoping people would pass through much more quickly. And so part of that was an interesting story, but what we did was we ended up putting it in the entrance. And so there are these stickers on the ground, but then with augmented reality, you can turn that archive into this three-dimensional experience. And a lot of people just hung out at the entrance and so it ended up being a really positive experience for us, but it was, they were rejecting us, and to us, we interpreted this in all sorts of negative, problematic ways. But I share this as an example of, I think we think of ourselves as an activist organization of mostly architecture type people. And part of what we saw as our work was not to give up and leave, but to make ourselves present and visible in whatever way we could with the messaging we want to communicate. So I think that's one thing that's useful for us to do, is if we have a message to express, if there is an architecture that to you is whatever, like say Hoviate Irani Tusha or something like that, there's like some identity that you want to express. And I know you're working in a different country, but if there's something there, to be hyper visible about it. That's also come up in a lot of the interviews we've done with students on campus. So one of our projects is studying white supremacy of our university campus. And a lot of students have talked about ways that they overcome the colorblind racism. They talk about it like people aren't intentionally racist to them, but the system is racist. They talk about the importance of hypervisibility, and that as like an activist thing to do, as a way to take on, as a way to be disruptive, like analogous to the things that these activists did in those courtrooms. They basically had no power. They couldn't do anything. There are all these structures that are limiting their ability to do things. The parallel structures that a practicing architect would deal with are like licensure, permitting, client demands. Like there are these structures that tell you you can't do what you want to do, but they were disruptive. They did things that got them into more trouble. So I believe in that kind of thing. I think it's a bit radical, and it's sometimes more harmful than good, but over the long course of history, I think disruptive acts help people in the future. I don't think that I would have the guts to do it myself, but if you're going to sacrifice yourself for some awesome architecture, go for it. But I think the more serious thoughts about activism and design, we came up with this distinction in one study we did, that ethnography I was talking about earlier, where we talked about ways people use their work for activism and ways they use their labor for activism. And so work is like, okay, through the design of a house, I'm going to create some communication about racism. Like I'm going to design it in some cool way. Like, for example, let me pull this up real quick. Sekou Cook hip hop architecture. Let me see if there is any images. So for example, this building over here, and this is not an actual build, it's just paper architecture, but sometimes, as we know, these things are useful. So one, through his work, he's trying to make a commentary about racism and the power of hip hop in combating racism as being a Black expression of anti-racist power. So this is through the work itself. A very different kind of activism that I think is as or more powerful is through organizing and through our labor. And this actually I learned from Iranian architects who would meet illegally underground just to talk about architecture, to decide ways that they wanted to challenge the new architectural theme park that was being built, you know, with these all these amazing, exciting projects, but they wanted to boycott it. Or there was that competition for motorcycles passing by. There was that competition for the Abbasabad Hills that the winning project had pre-Islamic architectural themes in it. So that was a form of resistance through the designer's work. But other architects said that that's not where our resistance comes. Our resistance comes by taking important posts in the institutions. Let us take over Anjumane Fulan. Let us take over Majale Me'mari. Let's create awards. Let's do these things. That's using our time and our organizing capacity as designers to do, you know, to challenge the state. So I don't know if that's useful, but that's one distinction of like things we could do through our work versus through our labor and organizing. So an example in the US and also in Canada is the Architecture Lobby. It's an organization that really focuses on like boycotting things. So they organize boycotts or strikes. These are tactics from labor agitators and labor activists. They use that as a way to stop the system. And one successful example that I happened to be involved with a couple of years ago was we got the Association of the American Institute of Architects Code of Ethics to change to make it unethical to design solitary confinement in prisons. So up until 2 years ago, architects could design, they still can, but now it's an ethical violation. We didn't design anything, but we changed laws. So that's another way that one could use their activism to do things. Omid.
Hello, thank you very much for sharing those articles, first of all. And as a personal, I really adore your somehow Sufist identity. It's absolutely evident in your passion that you shared with us in the presentation. And it reminds me of the interesting path you have paved in observing your experience world. Well, you implied that in our rapidly globalizing world, the confluence of space and identity, which, as you mentioned, there are different dimensions of differences such as sex and class and race and age and etc., has become an area of intricate complexity. As we deliberate on the role of environmental designers, it becomes imperative to ensure that the diverse tapestry of human experiences and identities are reflected in the spaces we design and inhabit. In one of those articles, Harvey's emphasis on broadening our understanding through diverse conversations and the conscious push to incorporate underrepresented communities into design narratives, which suggests a paradigm shift in how we perceive and shape spaces. With this background, I'd like to pose a question and know the answer from your perspective. I thought maybe if Sufi have some policy point of view and philosophy, and it was very interesting. The discussion on how environmental designers should consciously integrate the underrepresented into their plans resonates deeply. This stands in contrast to Harvey's proposition to foster diverse conversations that reflect a multitude of experiences, interests, and perspectives. Given this, what specific dimensions or traits of identity, in your opinion, should be prioritized to influence spatial imaginaries and that result in fairer designs? Philosophically, which aspects hold the potential to guide us in creating such inclusive spaces? And additionally, considering that racial identity intersects with other identities, how do you envision the experiences of other groups, such as religious or sexual minorities, influencing and being integrated into these designs?
Oh my gosh, that's awesome. Okay, I'm going to hop through. Thank you for these. These are so great. I wish I spoke with you all like 6 years ago before starting this stuff. This is really helpful. Let me sneeze and then I'll think. It's not coming. Okay, let me start from the middle and then move back. On this question of how environmental designers can create, facilitate, shape understandings, whatever verb, of spaces that are more rich, reflect that diverse tapestry you're talking about. What role can we play in arriving at that kind of built environment? Two thoughts come to mind. One is George Lipsitz, one of the articles I shared, he talks about, he has this really great book, I think it's called The Place That Race Makes or something. He talks about the white spatial imaginary and the black spatial imaginary. So the first half of the book is about the white spatial imaginary, and that's this idea of this kind of segregated society that ultimately, his analysis is sort of like a Marxist analysis that ultimately benefits the pockets of white people. So having a neighborhood without Black people in it makes your neighborhood more attractive. And so it increases the value of your home. And so whites have this, have now internalized these behaviors and all these things around the desire to increase their own privilege and access to money, say. That's kind of like a crude cartoon of his argument. But he says that a lot of the white spatial imaginary is in response to that. It's these spaces that are homogenous, are sterile, are elite looking, have expensive material and so on. Because all that results in higher value, higher exchange value. When he talks then about the Black spatial imaginary, and this was so cool for me, he talks about Black urban spaces, and he's talking more at the urban level, like neighborhood scale, block and neighborhood scale up to cities. He talks about mutualism, mutual aid, about collectivism. He even gets a little bit into kind of thoughts and philosophies on communalism, about even, he didn't do this, somebody else did this, but on anarchism. So there's some interesting kind of extensions of it, but that these Black spatial imaginaries are inherently more mutualist. They're about collective health. They're about community. They're different. They're not so much about use value or kind of like money, because those things have inherently in the US been withheld from Black and brown communities, just in the history of this country. So those communities have created strategies of living that, one can argue on what the root of them is. He argues that the root is because of this withholding of other different kinds of privileges, that they've come up and realized the most resilient, joyful, powerful way to live is in community with each other, sharing kitchens, eating together, doing all these kind of communal type of activities in our neighborhoods. So in Black and brown neighborhoods, you'll see many more communal spaces. You'll see a lot more different kinds of engagement of the public realm than you would in white neighborhoods and white spaces. So I think part of the response to your question is that one of environmental designers' kind of roles to enhance this diverse tapestry is to understand these different ways of creating and using space by these underrepresented and marginalized minorities, because those are ultimately probably more healthy, more equitable, maybe more egalitarian, more joyful kinds of spaces. White supremacy, I believe, has inherent in it a logic of extraction, a logic of paternalism, a logic of hierarchy that doesn't really serve anybody. It doesn't help many people. Maybe it helps like the 1%, but not the majority. So justice-oriented design to me is more like the Black spatial imaginary. So that's one thing, is like we could design those things. Personally, however, and this is not going to sound great, I don't have a ton of optimism. I don't think that we can. One is, I think for me, the biggest thing is, I think the logics of capital accumulation, capitalism, are so powerful, and the inherent patriarchy, the inherent racism in capitalism, I don't have much hope that we can outgrow it. I can't imagine this non-capitalist future. So I don't think that designers have many tools to make a significant difference. I think we can try things, we can get grants to do cool things and activate certain kinds of neighborhoods, and possibly, it'll accumulate, and over time there will be consciousness shift and things will be awesome. But the way things are going, we're so much further behind than the 1960s in terms of desegregation. Now, like there's more segregation in the United States schools than there was 60 years, 70 years ago. I have a very pessimistic personal outlook. So ignore what I just said. That's my personal opinion, but it conforms to some of, I mentioned Frank Wilderson's book, Afro-Pessimism, this idea that so much of contemporary globalized society today hinges for him on this anti-Black racist ideology that's hegemonic. We've all, and by hegemonic, I mean, not just it's widespread, but I mean, we have all consented to it. We all believe in it. So Iranians, me, I come here, I tell my postdoc who's Black that, no, this place is wonderful. You're problematic that you think the people in the cafe are mean to you. Like, I believe that myself, or I walk into this neighborhood and it's like, I want to buy a house here because it looks white. I don't say that, but I'm like, in my mind, in my imagination, it's a nicer place to live. It's somehow more civilized. It's somehow more, I bought into it and I consent to this ideology. And I think that consent or hegemony is so globally spread that even in Iran, even in Ghana, everywhere in the world, we've bought into it. I don't know why this image came in my mind, but I'm thinking of it like, I'm going to lose any potential friends I have now. But a random example is like eating meat, for example. I think a lot of us still think, no, traditional Iranian khorests are full of meat. I don't know that we actually know that. You know, our grandparents, who we might think are super traditional, are still a product of the modern era. Like, it's possible that we had a lot more vegetarianism in our cuisines. Who knows? But we don't believe it anymore. So if you go to an Iranian party, you're going to get meat. And you're going to have mixed in fruit, you're going to have mixed in Coca-Cola, you're going to have mixed in ice cream. These are things that we know are probably not really healthy for us or for the planet, but we do it and we believe in it. And to us, it's a symbol of like awesomeness. It's like, this is hospitality. So that to me is an example of hegemony. Like, we believe it, we buy into it. So there's a long way of saying, Omid, I personally don't have a ton of hope for that kind of beautiful idea of a globalized tapestry. The last thing I'll say is I just finished reading this book that was very challenging for me. It was Arturo Escobar's Designs for the Pluriverse, and it was a really great book. And I'll try like the 15-second short version. But he's imagining this, and he's a Marxist anthropologist. He's imagining this, to him, the future that's ideal is not this one globalized world where we all have this monoculture of kind of like modernity, like where there's this one idea of modernity that more or less everybody buys into, Coca-Cola, t-shirts, and like Madonna, like whatever contemporary version of that there is. He says that a pluriverse is a world where there are many different universes that they're aware of each other. They might be tied in like some rhizomatic way, but they're not trying to be each other. So it's like, basically it's a celebration of like indigeneity. And so like, what would an Iranian, like a Kurdish, Northwestern Iranian indigenous kind of built environment look like? That should be what it is. Tehran should not try to copy that. Sanandaj should not try to copy Tehran. We should not, blah, blah, blah. Like, so that's his argument. We should be this pluriversal world with these many different ways of creating the built environment. So anyways, that was a lot, but those are some thoughts in response to, Omid, your really, really great questions. I'll pass it over to Human.
Thank you, Shawhin. I'm in a very noisy place, so sorry for the...
You sound crystal clear. We don't hear the background. So
clear. Okay, that's great. So you've got given us a lot of foods for thoughts on this topic, along with the articles. I've got many questions, but I just asked the main one. So do you see any religious dimension to in a sense, this notion and concept of racist architecture? I give you an example. So in the context of the United States, so the way that, Protestantism and evangelism grew in the United States, and their exclusive churches, congregations, we could kind of extrapolate this to sacred spaces for Muslims or Jewish people, spaces where
if you belong to one category, one religion, you're allowed. But if you're not, I mean, most cases, you're not allowed. So do you see this, I mean, proliferation of white supremacist or racist spaces or architecture as an outgrowth of that traditional religious spaces where you would be disallowed if you were not part of that dominant category? What do you think?
Oh, that is so juicy. It's a bit above my pay grade, but I'll like all these questions, so I'll just think. Okay, let me think out loud. Sorry. My first thought was going to the ways religious spaces, and I haven't studied religious spaces, so I really don't know. I really know nothing. But the ways religious spaces are used, like, you know, the ways you described, hierarchically or spiritually or as congregation or as community or as worship or as defense or as supremacy, like I think all these happen. I don't know that that is inherent in the religiosity of the space. Like it might be kind of like the equivalent of institutional architecture, that we can take a classroom now, and a classroom to me is, I think my thinking today is that a classroom, lecture hall at a university is an expression of white supremacy, but that's because our academic institutions are white supremacist. If you take the same classroom and you go to a HBCU, a historically Black college or university, I actually think it's still white supremacist, even though there aren't white people using it. If we went, going back to, I think, Humayun's question, if we went 2,000 years ago and took the same classroom with us, would it be white supremacist before we had this idea? I start to not know as much. So coming back to religious spaces, I think I don't know that the racism that's inherent in so many religions now, and I think that's probably not so arguable. That's pretty obvious that a lot of religions, as practiced by their subgroup, by whatever group or congregation or whatever, espouse racist, explicit or implicit ideologies. I don't know if that's inherent in the religion itself more broadly, but maybe it is. And I'm really stuck on it because it reminds me of just the debates we have in Iran with, like, you know, Islam, and, you know, around the women's movement and women's bodily autonomy. And it's a very divisive conversation, as I'm sure you all know better than me, about, is there any version of, you know, Islam that's not patriarchal, or no, is it inherently patriarchal in its spirit? Is any kind of social order religion that has only men, you know, in its hierarchy, like, is that inherently going to be patriarchal? I think these are debates that are above my pay grade. At my pay grade, I think, yes, I think there is an inherent patriarchy, an inherent hierarchy in religions in general. And I think hierarchy translates really well to racism, to sexism, to homophobia, to all these things where somebody can utilize religion, religious spaces, religious practices, sermons, mambar, whatever you want, whatever dimension of religion. I think it's very easy to take advantage of those for these not so great, you know, things like racism and so on. But I have to think more about that. I really don't know. It's out of my depth. It's such a great question. Kartik.
I'm just gonna stop
sorry.
here for a second, Shawhin John. We are getting very close to the end of, we are getting close to 5, so we can take 2 more questions. But I want to, if we go forward, are you okay? Maybe another 15 minutes
Oh
after
yeah,
5,
this
but
is
okay.
so juicy
Sure.
for me, but I hope nobody feels pressure to stay on. I hope we can continue the conversation elsewhere too, but yeah, I can stay on.
Yeah, maybe just an extra 15 minutes, but we don't want to take your time too much either. So Kartik, please.
Hey, Shawhin. It's a really good presentation. I really liked the approach that you have taken towards architecture. So I have like 2 questions, main question. Before that, we are a tribal society, right? Like we are discriminate like one tribe from another. So we are fundamentally trying to protect ourselves, which becomes like it can be racist. It can't be racist. It can't be slavery. It's a survival mechanism that we had initially. and it became during World War and during so if you look at the white supremacy point of view, the biggest weapon that they had was education. They eradicated most of the schools that other communities had in order not to spread their language around the world. And still it happens in the media, because most of the media that's been consumed all over the world, it's North American, especially in Europe, US. And which brings me to the point, it is more or less like saturated at the point. Like if you talk about racism, people don't like, even if it happens, like people don't care so much right now, because it just became like so saturated. No, you're talking about it in the wrong way. Even if a person comments on you because of your color, it doesn't make a point right now. So that's another, so good that we bringing it up, but still there is no valid source that we can bring in the future. So my question is, two question is like, there is income difference still that happens in office space based on your race and gender. How do you solve that? And another question is, do you think a fundamental family is a problem for the racist society itself?
Can you say a little bit more about that question of the family? Is the fundamental family part of the problem of racism?
Yeah, so let's not like, it can be like a Freudian philosophy, like the way you brought up, like, so if either, because right now it's a nuclear family, before it was a joint family, and the society was brought to be a tribal society in that case, now becoming more separated. Is the separation a problem, or is the separation a good thing in terms of racism itself?
Wow. So let me start with the tribal society presumption. I'm really happy you brought that up. I want to quickly challenge that, though. I don't know if that's true. And this goes back to kind of thinking about our histories as constructed by us. And there are oftentimes agendas behind our histories, whether we know it or we don't know it. So, for example, our understanding of our past as tribal or of based on small kin networks, or however we understand our like this idea of like, oh, there's an inherent way that we as humans are, before industrialization changed us, or before capitalism changed us, or before X, Y, or Z changed us, even thousands of years ago, religion changed us or whatever. There's this natural state. I think that's something to not take for granted and to challenge. An analogy is, I'm looking at some trees outside, and for a lot of my growing up, we understood plants and trees in the forest as competitive. And that's the logic that drives their growth and their health, that like, okay, trees compete for more sunlight, and that's why they get taller than the other one. So it's this competition model. And that was understood as being inherently the logic of ways trees, live and thrive. But now science is showing us that it's actually much more complicated than that. Our current understanding is that the inherent logic is actually cooperative. There are these networks of rhizomes underground that channel, information and nutrition and even more complicated ideas for me to wrap my head around, but like care between plants. And they're actually mutualistic in these really deep, profound ways that, is like almost spiritual. And so scientists are grappling with that now, and we're like I assume this is a paradigmatic shift in our understanding of plant species and, plant blah, blah, blah. But that example helps me think that there are a lot of arguments that historians make, especially the historians who paint holistic pictures of the past. So like Jared Diamond and Guns and Steel, and like these kinds of historians that like try to understand the past in like kind of like succinct ways, where they impose a logic that's to our benefit now. Like it's beneficial to me to say, well, we are inherently tribal and we're inherently competitive, so that excuses my racist behavior. I don't think it's that way. I think it's actually much more complicated, and that racism and these attitudes that are selfish, supremacist, and whatever, those have existed for millennia. And that kind of reminds me of, again, I think Humayun's question was such a good one. It got me thinking about that. I don't know that, racism is limited to the transatlantic slave trade. It kind of goes, we have it in Iran for thousands of years. So with that, just kind of I think one point is we should destabilize those kinds of notions that kind of give us a free pass. On the question of family structure, that's a really interesting one, because family structure also is a construct, this idea of like, what is that immediate kin network? And that changes depending, and still in many parts of the world, it looks very different. And I'm not like a environmental or whatever it's called, environmental psychologist, and it's kind of like understanding social psychology. I don't know that stuff too well, but just kind of things I've seen here and there. There is not like an inherent normal family structure. It really depends where you are. It depends on, I think in the 60s, a lot of people were arguing it depends on climate, it depends on latitude and longitude, it depends on kind of like individuals. Like there may have been charismatic individuals that have come into society that shaped it in a different way, and things changed. It may have been, external factors, external factors like war and blah, 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 internal factors like famine. So I think all these things change structures of, families. So just having I have like a kindergarten level appreciation for that complexity, it makes your question so much more interesting to me, that with that variation of family structure, is there like some correlation to racist behaviors, how we understand who is self, who is other, how we maybe have this selfish urge to uphold ourselves compared to others? And I don't know, it's a really, really interesting question. Thank you. Charlotte.
Hi. So lately I've been thinking about how these same structures of white supremacy play out in the built environments as it relates to universities. And I was wondering if you've come across the Morrill Act of 1863, which granted lands to universities, but it was really on stolen native lands. And there was an act passed, I think 7 years later, that granted the same lands to HBCUs, but those have been institutionally underfunded. I was wondering if you could touch on how like white supremacy plays out through the lens of landscape architecture.
Yeah, awesome points. So cool. Yeah, I think, and actually we've had conversation in the past that inspired some of this thinking for me, but I think in our conversation, maybe you were sharing, sorry if I'm making this up, but ways, one might look at like a campus landscape design. So like in my school here, grass, lots of tree species that are not indigenous to this area. Grass is not, we're sort of this like alpine kind of desert geography here. And my sense is that a lot of this campus design is carried over from kind of like the East Coast Ivy League vibe of, kind of like what does an elite campus look like? There's like a certain vibe to it. Lots of grass, quads, and these kinds of things, certain kinds of trees, certain kinds of shade, certain kinds of, like in architecture, we talk about prospect and refuge, places where you can kind of like be hidden and see out and be seen. I think these aspects are references to those schools, and I think those schools are probably references to schools even earlier and across the Atlantic, so like the Oxfords and Cambridges and so on. So I think there is this referencing that if you follow, goes back to white and Western European, landscape architectural traditions. And I think there are two ways that those are racist. One is a lot of those traditions, like if you think about the English garden, are about extracting flora and fauna from other parts of the world and kind of putting them on display. So it's kind of like this museum of plants from the extents of the British Empire. Like, look at these exotic tropical plants that we have. Look at these things that we have. These are all things that us as kind of the British, designers of these landscapes and owners of these institutions have access to. So the landscape architecture of campuses can be interpreted as a representation of dominion and of empire. I think, and I haven't read this, so I'm probably making it up and I'm probably wrong, but I think it's not a stretch to say that it can also be reflected in university design, landscape design. So I think in that way, I think there's a possible argument for sort of like a white supremacy. The other way I think is maybe more straightforward, that these are white Western traditions, and they're things that popular culture keeps perpetuating and connecting to whiteness. So from Harry Potter to whatever other TV show of, happy, wealthy, white people on these campuses, having beautiful life experiences, and Dead Poets Society and this and that and the other thing. There is this reproduction of this correlation, in my mind at least, and I think many of our minds, of a certain kind of landscape, quads and like Gothic buildings, with this idea of excellence, of elitism, and not by intention, but by impact. That is a white imaginary. And so I think you're right, if I'm understanding your comment correctly, that the landscapes of our campuses, I think I agree, are white supremacist. And I'll share this example from this is a collage that one of our students made years ago. This is the Barbecue Betty incident in Oakland, where this is sort of a picturesque landscape. This is a park, and there's certain kinds of uses and people that are permitted. And, obviously everybody's quote unquote permitted, but in practice, if you're a black family and you come here and you barbecue, somebody's going to call the police on you. And their excuse is, it's not because you're black, it's because barbecuing is not allowed. And so a lot of us, me included, will be kind of surprised. Why is the black community up in arms about this? They shouldn't have been barbecuing, obviously. Like, good for the white person who called on them. But it doesn't work that way. It's much more complicated. The white family could barbecue there for generations, and nobody's going to think twice about it. In fact, I'm going to walk up to them and have a really, charming conversation with them. But as soon as the people who are not part of my supremacist circle are doing things, I might not intentionally know it, but it's that hegemony. Like, I've consented to it. Like, you're different. You don't belong here in my subconscious. And so I call on them. Sometimes I think a lot of times it's actually conscious. I think there is this, somebody talks about it as cognitive dissonance when they see a black person in a white space, and that it doesn't belong, whether it's like, my neighborhood is less desirable because these dangerous black people are here, or they play their music too loud, or they barbecue. Like, those are all things that white people do louder, more, but we don't register it that way. So Charlotte, I don't know if I'm answering your question or just totally agreeing with your suggestion that, yeah, I totally think that the landscapes of our campuses are white supremacist. Most of them. I think it's University of New Mexico or Arizona. They don't have quite like what we have here at CU Boulder, which is kind of looks like what you see in the picture on the slide. Theirs looks like, it uses indigenous plants and so on. So that's a different thing. I have to think about it. But your point about stolen lands makes that even complicated. Like, is there some kind of appropriation that's happening to make it okay to have this institution on that land that was stolen? It's got indigenous plants. So I want to think more about that.
Fantastic. Shawhin, maybe in the 8 minutes that we have to the end of this session, I ask one more question, but as a commentary to the work that you are doing. And I believe that you may have answered many of the, on many points, but I'm just gonna ask this to wrap up. And if you don't mind, I share my screen for that question.
Please, yeah, my section.
Okay. Oh, where is it? Here. So my question is about your involvement with Dark Matter University. So I want to ask this question: how can we effectively translate civil struggles from the streets and integrate them within institutions? Is internal critique a viable means to drive progress? And these questions that stems from Gramsci's ideas on molecular revolution, creating pockets of resistance to negate dominant hegemony. So I want to know how your practice in academia, your teaching pedagogy, right, can bring all these ideas of a street struggle, civil rights movement into teaching architecture.
Oh, so good. Thank you. And this I don't know why, but my mind also goes back to Iran a lot with this question, but I'm going to answer it for this research I share right now. But part of my brain, Yedongif Havasam, is to kind of like answering this with Iran in mind. Yeah, so can we effectively translate civil struggles from the streets and integrate them within institutions? I'll share two references on this. One is Joyce Bell, who I mentioned earlier. She was the sociologist who wrote about the courtrooms. She has another book, I think it's called Black Power Law. I might be making that up. Or no, Social Work and the, I can't remember the rest of it. Anyways, she has this book where she talks about ways professional institutions like the American Institute of Architects, she doesn't talk about them, but those kinds of member organizations, member societies, the social work equivalent, the law equivalent. She talks about how those institutions took up the flag of the civil rights movement after the marching in the streets stopped. So she says that in the late 60s, so Martin Luther King was assassinated in 68, for example, the late 60s and early 70s, a lot of the energy of the civil rights movement was translated by professionals, the professional class, which is a unique class, in their institutions. So they created things like, in America, there's NOMA, the National Organization of Minority Architects. It's parallel to the American Institute of Architects. It doesn't have as much power, but the Black architects in the 60s said, like, there's no way to reform the AIA. It's white supremacist. We can't get far. Let's create our own organization. In Iran, little things like this happen, like Majare Memari, I can't remember what it's called, Memar magazine in Iran. It was an attempt to create this kind of counter thing. And next to it was Majare Abadi settlements, which was more kind of like a government kind of controlled and owned architecture magazine. So there are these examples where a group that wants to kind of capture power creates its own organizations and its own institutions. I think Dark Matter University, this collective of a bunch of us, is exploring things like that, but I don't know if they're as radical as I want. But the kind of way we frame ourselves is kind of working with counter-institutionality and inter-institutionality. So working within and beyond, kind of like a Robin Hood model. Like, can we partner a studio between Yale University, which has a ton of money, and Howard University, which is a historically Black college and university, very prestigious, but not as many resources. Can we get Yale to fund it, but then it's students from both studios and we work on topics of racism. So we're playing with those kinds of models. Would you mind sharing your screen again, actually, Mariam? That was helpful to see. So that's one quick thought on this point about, can we translate the struggles into our institutions? I think there's precedent for doing it. Again, I hate to think this way, but I don't have a ton of hope. Like, to me, NOMA, that organization that was founded, Dark Matter University, like, I don't know how much we can change. I think power is beyond these institutions that we create. And I don't know what, so I don't have a ton of hope. I will say parenthetically, I think things that are happening in Iran right now may, to some extent, have some of those examples of like, what happens when the marching, I don't think the marching in the streets have stopped. It's less visible, it's different, but things have also gone into institutional realms, like, conversations on boycotts and strikes like that. So I think that's a very powerful thing. The other thing I'll speak to, going back to Gramsci's point on molecular revolutions, there's a feminist activist and journalist, Rebecca Solnit, and she writes about a similar idea in a much more accessible way to me. And she talks about, again, she uses that example of the rhizome we talked about a second, like mushrooms. And she talks about social movements. She was talking about the Arab Spring and how when you try to pinpoint what were those levers of power that ultimately triggered these changes that then kind of cascaded, she said, you can't look at the one person who burned themselves in a public space. You can't look at, certain political actors. You can't only look at certain student groups. You can't only look at striking workers. You can't only look at religious groups. You can't only look at the cartoonist who took ideas from Martin Luther King in the 1960s in the US and translated them to Arab language cartoons that inspired people to get agitated. She's saying it's not any one thing. It's this network of all these little micro forms of resistance, of dissent, that when the context is right, when there's enough rain, these roots have grown, then mushrooms kind of pop out. So she describes it that way. it's intriguing to me. Micro revolutions are intriguing to me. Molecular revolutions are intriguing to me. I have to learn more about it. And I guess I still don't know enough to kind of know where I like what my opinion is. I think I have it's probably come across. I don't have a ton of hope with the things that we do or that I do. But my attitude so far has been like, but what else? Like the hopelessness does not translate to inaction for me. The hopelessness does not mean, okay, bichiyadish, like close it, let's just go walk around with our rusaris, or let's go, not think about racism and just benefit from my privilege. That is definitely not the answer to hopelessness. I think the hopelessness is maybe more agitating potentially for me. Who knows in my future if I go deeper down this road, it might inspire desperation, which then might be things that I think are wrong, but I've been socialized to think is wrong. Like, okay, I'm going to say this quietly. Nobody tell anybody I said this, but I'm doubting the logic of nonviolence. I don't know if nonviolence, like Martin Luther King and all this, like it's celebrated. To me, it's like, it's an axiom. It's something that you never question. It's absolutely sacred. But I wonder if those are the same people are making that, axiomatic for me, who benefit from me never questioning that. So I wonder if hopelessness might lead to desperation, may lead to some kind of militancy. Not necessarily, I don't mean like militants as like shooting people. I don't mean that kind of violence, but other kinds of violence, like I will never teach again, or I'm going to boycott my classes, or I'm going to talk about very uncomfortable things that, blah, blah, blah. So I don't know. I don't think I have the guts to do those things, but your question gets me thinking about, do we need to go beyond, what's comfortable, what's assumed? How can we actively participate in reshaping institutional pedagogy of teaching architecture? Again, here, since at least the 1960s that I'm aware of, radical architects have been proposing changes to our curriculum, to our syllabi. And Sharon Sutton, she's a Black architect in New York. She has a great book called When Ivory Towers Were Black. And she writes about Columbia University in the late 1960s. And there was this revolution that was happening with the civil rights, but it translated to a big change in the architectural curriculum. And they changed it, and it was amazing. But 5 years later, it all rolled back. So those activists were much more radical than I think we are. I mean, these were people who were, going to prison. They were gambling with those stakes that we don't. So I think there are a lot of great ideas for changing our pedagogy and teaching. Again, similar thing. I don't know how hopeful I am. To me, they all make sense. They're all good. Maybe there is this changing tide now that's new and didn't exist before. But maybe I think if I had to put a guess down, like if I had to guess, I think it needs more robust forms of refusal. Like all architects across the country need to stand together and stop teaching and say, we'll never teach again until we all teach differently. I think that level of organizing and activism has to happen for there to be meaningful change. I don't think the incremental changes will succeed.
I would like to express my gratitude for entrusting our platform to bring this very critical presentation, right? And like you, I'm hopeless on many grounds, but I love the things that you said about this cognitive liberation, this interrogative attitude, and the understanding that our molecular agencies, right, maybe at some point can lead to that growing of the mushroom, right? Maybe not just yet, but what we are doing here now, these kind of conversations that we have, maybe it starts opening ideas, and that maybe at some point it dramatizes, radicalizes, and then turn into this revolution that we are all waiting for, right? And Shawhin, the other thing is that I very much enjoyed, your honest voice, right? This the fact that you took these questions with so much confidence, and you are thinking and you are making us to think alongside with you. Thank you very much for this very, very informative session, and I'm sure that our audience, we are going to put it on YouTube, and many people are going to benefit from it.
Oh, no.
If you want to say anything, what the platform is yours. But thank you very much.
No, just massive thank you. Yeah, to the organizers, to the great and challenging questions. My notebook is like 4 pages full, so I really appreciate it. If anybody has thoughts or questions you have to pass on to me, I would selfishly really enjoy that. If anybody has the energy to hop on a call at any point in the future, let me know. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much, Mariam, for the invitation.
Thank you very much, Shawhin. And thank you very much, all of you, for dedicating your Sunday afternoon to be with us, and looking forward to see you in our future session. Have a great day.
شب همگی بخیر.
Bye.